Good day and welcome to SCO BRICS Insight, where we talk about the latest news, information and analysis of what's really going on in Russia and the BRICS. Now, my name is Rod Mackenzie, and today I want to talk about that. Back in 2022, at the beginning of the Russia special military operation in the Ukraine, the US and the EU imposed their shock and awe sanctions. They also cut off most Russian banks from the SWIFT network, and Joe Biden declared on TV that the Russian currency, the ruble, would be rubble by the end of the week, and the Russian economy would collapse under the sheer weight and number of the sanctions imposed on it. Let's not forget also the Empress of Europe, Ursula von der Leyen, proudly proclaimed that the Russian economy was going to be in tatters. Tatters, I tell you, tatters. So, funny how 3 years on it's the EU economies that are in tatters, and I tell you, not only is the Russian economy not in tatters, it's booming, and the ruble didn't turn to rubble, but is now a strong currency in international trade. Now, this information I'm about to tell you is going to come as a bit of a surprise to you. Plus, many of you might actually think it's rank hypocrisy by the US because it's been reported that the majority of the multi-billion-dollar trade turnover between Washington and Moscow, which is circumventing the sanction restrictions and gaining momentum, and is currency they're using for the US imports of Russian goods, is the Russian ruble. Now, the key point to note is that the ruble has become the predominant payment currency, a factor that the West has been overlooking. Now, it's on this issue that the interests of Russia and the US paradoxically converge. So what factors actually contributed to this thing happening? Now, US businesses purchase a number of different products, but they're all characterized by the fact that the US cannot source them elsewhere. And these are things like fertilizers, enriched uranium, and timber, plus precious metals via intermediaries. Now, the US spent around $1.6 billion on Russian fertilizers in the first half of 2025, according to the US Department of Agriculture. And they do this because they can't produce sufficient domestic fertilizers because of a lack of gas pipelines from the fields to deliver the gas to the US fertilizer production plants, as most of the pipelines are designed to go to either LNG plants on the coast or for petrochemicals production. So enriched uranium exports to the US in 2025 were actually down by 20%, but that was due to the US energy companies having stockpiled supplies in advance of the so-called ban on uranium enriched from Russia, which Congress approved back in the middle of 2024. Now, this bill turned out to have a bit more holes in it than a Swiss cheese and more exceptions in it than an American politician gets for avoiding being drafted into war. But of course, it also doesn't come into effect until 2027. So currently they're still spending around $1.2 billion with Russia for enriched uranium. And bear in mind that nuclear energy in the US powers 37% of its electricity grid, and without the Russian uranium, the lights would go out all over the USA. Plus, as the plan for more nuclear plants to power the hungry artificial intelligence boom through the server farms, that importing Russian uranium is going to only increase and continue. Now, one of the most surprising US imports from Russia is timber, from plywood to wood beams for housing construction. Although the US produces a large amount of timber, it's not sufficient, and according to analysts, Russian plywood is cheaper and more durable than its US equivalent. Plus, timber beams used in housing construction are of a higher quality, plus they have a better pricing despite the freight costs from Russia. So, the US spends $3.5 billion with Russia in the first 6 months of 2025 using rubles, and Russia buys $300 million worth of US medical equipment, and it's one of the few countries in the world that the US did not impose trade tariffs on, plus they now pay in the Russian currency rubles. Russia, by the way, also imports some medicines and chemical analysis devices from the US, but not a big deal, at only $300 million or so. So it appears that Donnie's trade deficit strategy eradication doesn't actually apply to Russia. Now, before I continue, I'd like to make an appeal. If you enjoy my videos, you can help me fund the channel and contribute to its further development. You could do this by making a small donation, which you can do by clicking on the thanks button at the bottom right hand side of the screen, sometimes under the three dots, or alternatively by clicking on the Buy Me a Coffee link below in the credits. Everybody who donates does get a personal thank you from me, and please keep the comments coming. Love to read them, love to respond to them. Now, while it may seem premature to discuss significant trends, the Russian Chamber of Commerce has noted a significant increase in trade turnover between Russia and America. Sergei Katrin, the head of the chamber, has stated that the figure increased to $3.8 billion in the first half of this year, with Russian exports accounting for $3.5 billion of this total. In 2024, the total of Russia's exports to the US was around $10 billion. And it's noteworthy that just 3 years ago, the prospect of settlements in rubles between the US and Russia was regarded as impossible, as the dollar was king and the dominant global currency, and the ruble was not even traded on the international markets like the euro, the dollar, the pound sterling or the yen. Now, in the current economic climate, this is a key consideration, and it's rather amusing to note that Washington's introduction of sanctions has contributed to the resurgence of the ruble as a significant global financial trade instrument. Now, in the midst of this dynamic political landscape, a subtle yet pivotal transformation has occurred. The use of the Russian currency in transactions with both North and Latin America has increased significantly, rising from 29% to a record level of 69% in just 1 year. Now, this is shown in the data that I get from the Central Bank of Russia. Now, the current time period is noteworthy because it's one of the most significant in the history of international payments and settlements, of clearing and settlement. For comparison, it took the euro almost 10 years to reach a similar level in global trade as the ruble now has. Now, Arthur Lear, who's vice president of the Association of Russian Exporters and Importers, and he's also the managing partner of the Lex Alliance law firm, believes that the transition to the use of rubles by Russia's trading partner is now already part of a major global trend. Now, this is largely due to the objective restrictions placed on it in the global financial sector. Now, the sanctions pressure on the ban on settlements in hard currencies like the euro and the dollar using SWIFT has driven the general global trend towards expanding the use of national currencies, and they are creating the need for alternative forms of financial interaction. Now, in these circumstances, the rubles become very convenient, despite having become a largely forced instrument for maintaining trade and partnership relations. Now, the ruble is also strengthening in other areas, with significant gains recorded in international settlements for the growing trade of Russia with Africa and Oceania, where it's now at 70%, and the Caribbean at 81%. For these regions, the Russian currency is not only beneficial, but a strategic political move to mitigate the risks they have that are associated with their settlements in dollars or euros. Now, as Vladimir Kovrigan, who's Associate Professor of Institute of Economics, Management and Law at Moscow State University, points out, the geography of the ruble's use is expanding even widely on an annual basis, and it's evident that the SCO and BRICS countries are achieving notable success in settling records in their own trade using their national currencies. Now, this is largely attributable to the advantageous position they find themselves in, given the ease which they can conduct trade in either the Russian ruble or their own national currencies like the yuan or the rial, etc. Now, the ruble share in trade with Europe has also grown significantly, and that's exceeding now 60%. Now, this obviously started when the Russian President Vladimir Putin insisted that all Russian gas exports have to be paid for in rubles, and this forced compliance also stabilized the ruble as a currency. So then the settlements with the EU countries could not use transfers in both dollars and euros for business buying Russian gas, and that obviously made sure that they couldn't attack the ruble. Now more than half of Russia's exports are already settled in rubles. Now Lear explains that this is ensured by positive circumstances. Firstly, it's in the best interest of Russia because it's now one of the largest economies in the world, and one that actually produces stuff like actual commodities that everybody needs as opposed to services. It means it will always earn in any way, and particularly its own currency. Now this is evidenced by the growing number of non-Western companies who are involved in Russia in things like infrastructure and business projects, particularly the Chinese and from the Middle East. There's also the strategic desire of countries to reduce their reliance on the use of the dollar and the euro, and that does play a role. Now this has resulted in an increase for demand for the use of trade in national currencies, and banks have started to use this now as the standard instrument for international settlements, the Economist explains. Now, the precise figures for the volume of Russia's currency in settlements is still a bit unclear. We know most of it's in rubles, but how much is in yuan or rupees, etc., or reals, is not quite clear, but that will become clear. However, the increasing number of countries and companies adopting the ruble signifies a positive shift and a gradual strengthening of the Russian position. Now, the Russian currency has now become a global payment instrument. And okay, it may not be challenging the dollar or the euro in the West, but within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS, and trade with the global South, like ASEAN or the Middle East, it's made a huge impact. So the dynamics of this trade are dependent on Western policy. If they continue to put pressure on the Russian banking sector, then settlements in rubles and national currencies will become systematic and can only increase. Now, Reagan actually thinks the trend will be stable in this case, so Trump's fear of de-dollarization is not unfounded, as the SCO, the BRICS and their allies continue to abandon the dollar as a trading currency, and should external conditions soften, a partial return to global currencies is a possibility, but in my opinion, once unlikely. Once they froze the Russian foreign currency assets in the West, the whole membership of the SCO, BRICS, OSEA, and the countries of the African Union realised they could be next, and getting away from the dollar was essential. The sanctions that had transpired have acted as a crucible whereby the ruble, once viewed as a weak Russian link, has been strengthened and transformed into a pivotal financial instrument in global trade. It's become a means of conducting business between major economies like China, India, Russia, Brazil. And the West has experienced the opposite outcome. Rather than creating the isolation of Russia, what we've witnessed here is the accelerated emergence of alternative systems in which the use of national currencies have become the norm. So it's no wonder that Trump wants to punish everybody as he sees that people have to buy dollars to trade and prop up his currency. So now that's why he gets angry. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Set the alert bell so you get notified when I post a video. And if you want to help me out, make a donation by clicking on the thanks button or on the Buy Me a Coffee link. Thank you.